July 26, 2012, WIKISPEED suspension assembly. So this is the front suspension. To my right hand side is the front of the car. There's the seat facing forward. We've just taken it off and taken it apart. This is car number 1 here. And this suspension is similar to the one that's in Texas. So these instructions are for front suspension assembly, particularly for Kashif in Texas. So if we're looking directly from the side, we know the suspension plate is faced forward because this set of bolts is leaned slightly back, and also because the shorter side is forward. The longer taper is to the rear. So now we know the plate is facing the front of the car. Then here we have the strut top mount. There's a slightly different design in Texas, and it bolts onto the plate anywhere there's clearance for the bolts to go through, anywhere that doesn't interfere with the chassis. So as many bolts as you can fit, with a washer on each side if it fits. On here we don't have them on the back because they don't fit. But washers on both sides to share the load. Then here these strut top mounts are metric 10mm by 1.25 thread. So the nuts to put on these bolts is M10 by 1.25 is the diameter. So 10mm diameter by 1.25 is the thread. And then that holds, this is the shock, or the strut, or the damper. All words for the same thing. It's made by Skunk 2. It's their Skunk 2 Pro C racing product, which is for the 2006 or newer Honda Civic on the front. We use the front at all 4 corners. So this damper, or strut, or shock, bolts in with these 3 bolts into the strut top mount, this piece of aluminum here, onto the suspension mount plate. The suspension mount plate is connected to the strut top mount with 3/8 by 24 thread grade 8 bolts with washers. As many as you can fit that won't interfere with the chassis. Then the chassis connects to the suspension plate with 8 grade 8 bolts. Again with washers. And if we look inside the chassis, you can see where you'd reach in to tighten the backside. To tighten the back for, you'd reach your arm inside the chassis and hold a wrench, and on the outside you'd hold a wrench or a socket and tighten the other end. So again, washers on both sides. There's 8 altogether, 2 at each corner. So now we'll have a strut top mount, a suspension plate, and a damper all connected to the chassis. It helps to connect the suspension plate to the chassis first. That way you can see which of these bolt holes to use. Then connect the damper to the strut top mount, then the lower control arm. The lower control arm is this, or A-arm, or LCA, all words for the same thing, is this aluminum triangle. It connects with spherical rod end bearings. The spherical rod end bearings have 2 orientations, and we only use 1. See this oval here, this oval part? That's on the x-axis. It could also be placed this way. We don't want to do that because then the strongest angle is in the up and down instead of in the side to side. So align them this way, where you have this oval part here in the x-axis pointing towards the tire. So we put one in the very front corner and one in the very back or second to back corner. And again, we use a washer on the top, and if we have room on the bottom, although these are kind of short, we don't always have room to put a washer on the bottom as well. And so they bolt on, again, it's 3/8 by 24 thread. And then they bolt on from the inside, 3/8 by 24 thread. Now this one, on the version that you have in Texas, requires drilling into the chassis to make clearance for the nut. And so this one needs to be put on the suspension plate before the suspension plate is attached to the car. And then a hole here is drilled into the chassis. And that hole would be about 3/4 of an inch, 0.75, or 1 inch in diameter. The cheap way to do that is with what's called a stepper bit. So if you ask at Harbor Freight or a hardware store for a stepper bit, it's much cheaper typically than a 1 inch or a 3/4 inch bit. So you'd mark this hole, drill it in the chassis, and that provides a hole for the bolt on the other side of this to go in. So here we can see the bolt. I think I got it. I can't quite see what I'm pointing towards. I don't know if I got that. I can't quite see. But there you can see the bolt on the other side. The same thing is here, but it's inside the chassis. So we drill a clearance hole in the chassis, and then the plate itself is held on by these 8 bolts all around. So here's the bottom ones. Okay, so now we have the lower control arm mounted, the damper mounted, strut top mount strut top mount mounted and the suspension plate mounted. This is the last connection. This bottom joint here is the knuckle lower pivot. It bolts on with 1-2 bolts, or 1-2 nuts, and then a bolt through here. And then it attaches to the knuckle here. The knuckle is this black or dark brown cast iron piece. So we have this pivot here. This is one piece, and it connects with 1-2 nuts, they're metric, and then one bolt, it's metric, and then a castle nut with a little pin that goes through the top to keep the castle nut from rotating. So that's how this connects to the knuckle and the lower control arm. And then these bolts, which I think are M14, and then 40 millimeters I believe is their length, connect these two to hold the damper onto the knuckle. Now we have a knuckle attached to the car. Now for the wheels themselves, we use lug nuts to connect them. And Kasha, if you in Texas have a set of steel wheels, we'll hope to send you a set of prettier alloy wheels as soon as we can afford them. And then you have the world's best lug nuts. You have some magnesium alloy Skunk 2 Black Series lug nuts. And so those are the funky, beautiful shaped black nuts that go on these points. And you have 20 altogether, 5 for each wheel. And those will be way too good looking for those black steel wheels, but they'll hold them on for now to put the car on its wheels. And then as soon as we can afford them, we'll send you alloys. So again, for part count, strut mount plate or suspension mount plate, it helps to put this on first, but do mark this hole and then take the plate back off and drill into the chassis a clearance hole for this spherical rod end bearing. Then bolt the rest of the bolts on, all 8, for the suspension mount plate. Then connect the strut top mount with as many bolts as will clear, with washers on both sides. All these are washers on both sides. Then connect the damper with 3 M10 by 1.25 thread nuts. Then connect the lower control arm with its spherical rod end bearings, or these are also called Heim joints. And again, note the orientation. This oval is in the x-axis. It points towards the tire. That's the strongest dimension. The most metal is here, and that's where it's rated in radial, ultimate radial fail load. So it needs to be this position. And again, washers on both sides if you can fit them. Then the lower knuckle pivot, and that's also called an upright. These all have different names. So this black or brown piece in here that's quite dark is called the knuckle or the upright. And so that attaches it. And then these M14 bolts attach the damper to the upright. And then the lug nuts attach the wheel, and you now have a car on its wheels. Now what that doesn't do is we haven't sent you a steering rack yet, Kashif. So we need to do that. But in the meantime, here's how the back wheels are kept straight. So now I'm at the back of the car. There's this part, which is a tie rod end, stock Honda part, and then we have it in a bracket. And that requires drilling 2 holes in this lower control arm and bolting this part in. We are going to send you these brackets pre-drilled, and we're going to send you 4. So the front wheels will be pointed statically straight. They won't turn yet, but that way the car has all 4 wheels straight until we send you a steering rack. Then you'll take the front 2 off. And then the back 2 will stay the same for now to keep the wheels pointing straight. And those parts I hope we're going to machine tonight and send you. These brackets, these toe brackets is what they're called, that keep the wheel pointed straight. And I believe you already have these tie rod ends. If not, we'll send them to you. And again, you can see the rear is identical to the front. Again, this way is the front of the car, and you can see the shorter angle is on top, the longer angle is on the rear, and the damper is tilted slightly back. That's how we know we're going forward. That's our caster angle, the angle of the damper. There you go, Kashif. Hope it helps.